Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
We reconstructed this, and this is something that your listeners would be shocked by. She was 13 seconds ahead of Lee. He sees a white van driving past. He gets to the Holden Hedge, and Sarah's nowhere.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martyn Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
We've had some fantastic comments from you, the listeners. Loving the show, says a day one listener who really enjoyed the debut double episode we did on Fred and Rose West. It's still out there, so if you missed that double episode, our debut episode, do go back and find it. Thanks for that, Sarah.
There's another comment from a listener who wants to remain anonymous. She's just been listening, she says, to the episode Sleeping with a Psychopath. She said, I'm in tears. And thank you to Carolyn, that's Carolyn Woods, the victim of conman Mark Acklam, who gave a compelling interview with us. She said, thank you to Carolyn for bravely sharing her story.
Do keep your comments coming in. We read every single one of them, and it's really, really nice to hear your feedback. In this double episode, how what began as an innocent game on a summer's day turned into a nightmare, gripping the nation for months. This is the story of a murdered 8-year-old, Sarah Payne, who on July the 1st, 2000, vanished whilst playing hide-and-seek with her 2 brothers and sister in a cornfield in Kingston Gorse near the Sussex coast. It was a shocking case, which eventually led to a new law giving communities the right to access information about registered sex offenders living in their areas. In this episode, we'll be talking to Detective Inspector Martyn Underhill, known as Tosh, who was Deputy Senior Investigating Officer in the case, about Sarah's disappearance and the frantic police investigation. And in our next episode, we'll explore the extraordinary forensics which led to the successful prosecution of local paedophile Roy Whiting for Sarah's murder. Martyn, you covered this story from start to finish, and I remember from reading about it in your book, actually, you felt a real connection to this case.
I think for lots of reasons, this was a crime that deeply resonated with me, partly because it happened in my part of the world. I was living in West Sussex, and it was only a few miles from my own family home, and you did really get a sense of how the community had been shattered. The sense of safety had changed. My daughter was a couple of years younger than Sarah at the time, and I've always said to my kids that they really do need to be very careful about the way they conduct their lives, because there's such a thin dividing line between life and death, and something dreadful can happen at any moment. And I think the story of Sarah Payne's disappearance, was a horrible and vivid example of that point that I'd always made to my own children.
I suppose it's overused, isn't it? Every parent's worst nightmare, but that's exactly what it was. And the search for Sarah and the hope she was still alive gripped the nation and dominated the news for days, didn't it?
It did. It became a story that dominated my life as a crime reporter, and for days and days it led our bulletins, and it's easy to see why. And again, there were lots of reasons for it, but something that I always remember are those very emotional family appeals. Sarah's parents made a number of public appeals with and without the police sitting beside them. And above all, it was, I think, the parents' compelling belief for those 2 weeks before Sarah's body was discovered, their compelling belief that Sarah would be found alive and come home. There were lots of things I remember, but particularly Sarah's grandfather, Terry Payne, reading the messages that had been written to Sarah by her siblings, her 2 brothers and her sister. And there were other things like the family visiting the incident room. Sarah's parents taking the young kids, the siblings, into the incident room during those first 2 weeks while the search was going on to thank the officers, the police officers, for the work they were doing. I'd never encountered that kind of episode in this kind of story before.
Also, what was perhaps a little bit different for you is that you were so close to home, and there you were reporting on this horrific story. And there seemed to be, I recall reading in one of your chapters, just a complete disconnect with the horror of the crime and your day-to-day life reporting it.
I think for that reason, yeah, I did find it quite a personal experience. And I just kept feeling there was this real sense of my good fortune. For a start, instead of traipsing on the train to London every day to my office in a hot and sweaty July, I was driving across the South Downs in glorious sunshine to a very nice part of the world. And that was in such complete contrast to the experience that Sarah's family were going through, hoping against hope that Sarah would be found alive. And I think my sense as a crime reporter, particularly as time went on, that this was a story that was going to end in tragedy, and a story that was keeping me busy, keeping me at the forefront of my job at Sky News. I was getting on the television every day, and all of that was good for me, but at the same time, I was dealing with a horrific story that I almost knew, I think, was going to end in great sadness.
Let's go back to the beginning, if we can, and how the tragedy unfolded. What do you remember about initial reports of Sarah's disappearance?
Well, I got involved in the story on day 2, and I think that's quite common. You get reports of a child that's missing, and of course 9 times out of 10 they turn up. They've wandered off, or they've got lost, and there's an innocent explanation for their disappearance. But of course, within a few hours, if the child hasn't turned up, then concerns are raised. Sarah was playing hide and seek with her siblings in a cornfield. It was a summer evening around 8 p.m. She'd hit her head and had had a kind of fallout with her siblings and had run crying towards her grandparents' house. The family was staying there for the weekend. It was only a few minutes' walk away. She crossed the field in some distress because of the injury, popped out through a hedge and into a narrow country lane, and then she vanished.
And as a missing child case, it attracted huge media coverage, didn't it?
It did. It went on long past the moment that Sarah's body was discovered. But for those 2 weeks, there was this sense of the family's hope. And who's to say that it might have ended happily? But as I said, my sense was that this was a story that would end in tragedy. But the story of a missing child is always going to be compelling for our viewers, for readers of newspapers. And I think more than anything, it was because this happened at the start of the school holidays, and it was a scenario, a child had gone missing in a scenario that almost all of us recognised, particularly those of us who are parents, our children playing innocently in a field, in the sunshine. What harm could possibly come to them? And of course, for most of us, it doesn't end in tragedy. But the idea that this did particularly resonated with the vast majority of our audience. And I think what also helped was the fact that Sarah's mother, was a very media-friendly parent who recognised that it was important to make public appeals, to try and persuade anybody with information to come forward. And again, this happened at a time, as I said, the school holidays, but it's what journalists call the silly season. It's at a time when there's very little news happening. Parliament's closed, the courts are shut. We look for what we call silly stories. But of course, this was a very serious story. And because our news bulletins tended to be rather empty at that time of the year, that's another reason why this story became such a big story.
And was there, Martyn, a real sense of urgency in the way the police handled this and in their investigation?
I think it's probably obvious that that urgency applies to all cases of missing children. As soon as the first few hours have passed and that child hasn't turned up, then the police will treat it as a potential crime and throw resources into it. And I'm sure we'll hear from Tosh Underhill about the level of resources that were applied to this story.
They even handed out their mobile numbers, didn't they, to you to try and keep those lines of communication open?
Yes, it was a rather unusual situation because I went down the day after Sarah had disappeared, and I remember interviewing Tosh and his boss, Alan Ladley. The first time I interviewed them, at the end of the interviews, both of them said, look, here are our mobile phone numbers. If you need to call us, it would be good to keep in touch. And that was an extraordinary thing. From the first moment, it seemed that officers involved and the journalists were building up a level of trust.
Well, we can ask the man himself now, because I'm delighted to say that we are joined by Detective Inspector Martyn Underhill. That sounds very formal, Martyn. It's Tosh, isn't it? Who was Deputy Senior Investigating Officer on the Sarah Payne case. Welcome to True Criminals. Good to have you with us.
Hi, thanks for asking me to come in.
Tosh, what are your memories of first hearing about Sarah Payne's disappearance and the immediate hours afterwards?
Interestingly, I was on my boat. I used to have a boat on the Medway, and I was on my boat on a beautiful sunny evening, as Martyn described, and I became aware of it. And it was very unusual. That's the first thing I remember. Martyn and I have walked the same road for many years. I've dealt with lots of tragedy and murder, as has Martyn, but this is unusual. And as soon as I heard about it, I thought, okay, not sure how this one's going to pan out. It's really, really unusual and complicated in the sense that, well, it's complicated anyway, this sort of case, but this was a family who came down to see relatives in a different county and were on a huge beach full of thousands of people, and a child's gone missing 100 yards away in a field, as Martyn described. So I found myself driving to this incident thinking, this is a life-defining case for me. I've always believed that I do things because of a reason, that something is there for that reason. And I joined the police force and I was always thinking, what is the reason? And then Sarah Payne happened and I thought, this is the reason I'm here.
When something like this happens, Tosh, what's the first thing that your officers do? Is it an immediate search of the area? What do you get cracking on straight away in that? Is it the golden hour, if you like, or that golden window of somebody who's disappeared? What are the most important things to do?
Okay, I'll give you that in a sec, but I was going to pick up something Martyn said, and this isn't a case of trying to diss anybody or we were better, but actually in Soham and Millydale, both two very high-profile cases similar to Sarah, the police didn't grasp what they were dealing with on the day. In Soham, it went above an inspector on day 2, and I will always give a shout-out to a guy called Jeff Lister, who was the duty inspector at 8 o'clock on that Saturday, because as soon as the call came in, he realised what he was dealing with. And when you think 300,000 people go missing a year in this country, this inspector looked at that call and thought, nah, this isn't right. And he put the balloon up. And within an hour of that phone call coming in from Sarah, we had an SIO, Alan Ladley, at the scene. And we call it putting the balloon up. And by putting the balloon up early, we were able to have nearly 300 officers on the scene before midnight on the day she went missing. And I'm incredibly proud of that, but I'm proud of it because of what Jeff Lister did, and a huge shout out to him. And actually, if you examine Soham and Millie, that didn't happen. And we gained a lot because of what Jeff did, because we had detectives on the ground, we had 300 officers on the ground searching through the night, trying to find a little girl. And the reason why that's so important is what we call the catchment database. I don't know if your listeners have heard of the catchment database, but the catchment database was created by a detective inspector in Derbyshire Police. He dealt with the child murder and thought, we haven't got enough information here. So he created a catchment database, and he went right back to the Moors murders, and then every time a child went missing in this country, he updated the database, which meant that on day 2, when Martyn's just picking up the story, I was able to say to Chuck Burton, he's the detective inspector involved, this is what's happened, what are our chances? And he said, she's dead within 6 hours, Tosh, and she'll be dumped within 50 yards of the main road. So rather like Martyn alluded to, I knew right from the start of this inquiry what I was dealing with. But we had two incredible parents who wouldn't let us even think it, let alone talk it. And they kept the hope alive. But just like Martyn, because of Chuck Burton, I knew statistically, and he looked at over 500 abducted and missing children, I knew statistically she was probably dead by midnight that day, as in fact she did turn out to be. So going back to your question, what do you do? Well, we had 300 officers on the plot by midnight. We had a helicopter doing infrared heat seeking, and we were searching those fields mechanically at the same time as trying to capture the evidence from the family, because the family were obviously distraught. And don't forget, 3 of the key witnesses were children. But what came out in the first few hours, the golden hours as you called it, was 2 things. The SIO, Alan Ladley, came up with 10 hypotheses. And whenever I tell people that, they raise their eyebrows and think, 10? But there are 10 hypotheses why a little girl goes missing. And I'll take you through those quickly. First one is trapped in a badger set or fallen in the ditch, fallen in a river. And that really struck a bell with me because we had, I don't know if Martyn covered it, about 6 years before that, a 6-year-old boy in Hampshire went missing. The police searched the field he was last seen in 6 times, and on the 7th search, the little boy was found with a broken neck. He'd fallen into a badger set. So that was the first. The second was an accident while playing with their siblings, and the siblings had hidden Sarah. Third was a family argument. The fourth was familial abuse, and she'd run away. The fifth was medical collapse. Was she diabetic? Had she collapsed in some way? Run off with a peer because she went down there every other weekend to her grandparents. They had done all of her life. She knew other children in the area. Was she kidnapped for money? We discounted that one very quickly because you don't kidnap a child of a family who live in a council house and haven't got much money. And then you've got abduction by someone she knows. You've got to remember that the Payne family are 48 strong. She had 48 nephews, nieces, uncles, aunts. Incredible, huge family. Was she abducted by someone in her family? And then the last and least likely was a stranger abduction. But we started looking at that on the night.
Tosh, the witness statement from Sarah's brother Lee was very important, wasn't it? You've talked about
Yes.
your interviews with those who might have known something. Lee's evidence was crucial, wasn't it? What did he tell you?
Okay, so Lee was the eldest child, and basically the family on the beach, beautiful sunny day, and the parents, about 5 o'clock, as most of us would do, said, look, kids, go home to Nanny, and we're going to go to the off-licence, get some drinks, and we're all going to have a barbecue with Nanny. So the kids went back to Nanny, the parents went left, the kids went right, and the kids, when they got to Nanny, said, can we play in the field, Nanny? And the field is literally 100 yards. I don't know if Martyn actually went to the location and looked at it, but from the kitchen window of Terry's house, the grandparents' house, you could see where the kids were playing on a swing under a tree. It was that close. And so the siblings were all playing. Sarah falls over, cuts her knee, bangs her head, and says, I'm going home to Nanny. Lee's the oldest child, so he's thinking, this isn't good because I'm going to get in trouble. So he says, don't do that. I'll come here, I'll give you a cuddle. And she says no, and she runs off. And she runs off directly across the field to a place where there's a small cut in the hedge, small passing space for cars and a cut in the hedge. And we know because we reconstructed this, and this is something that your listeners would be shocked by. She was 13 seconds ahead of Lee. 13 seconds, because he realised as she started running, if she gets to Nanny before me, I'm going to get in trouble. So he starts running after her. 13 seconds. And as she goes to the hedge and disappears, he sees a white van driving past, and it's a big white van with a roof that goes over the hedge. And he sees the van drive off. He gets to the hole in the hedge, and Sarah's nowhere. Unbeknown to him, but now known to us, that white van contained Roy Whiting, who for the last 3 hours had been driving up and down the coast of Sussex looking for a child to abduct. And we eventually established, and this came out in the trial, that 7 members of the public had phoned up that afternoon saying there's a white van acting suspiciously around my children. He was out there looking to steal a child, and by complete misfortune, he drove down that road as Sarah ran out the hedge. She goes in the footwell, van drives off, Lee gets there to see no Sarah, and he sees a white van 100 yards away driving down the road towards his nana. And that's another thing that has caused severe issues for Lee as a child and now as an adult, because his sister was in that van. He didn't know that. The van turned round in a cul-de-sac 50 yards from the grandparents' house and then drove past Lee, who's still looking for his sister, who, unknown to him, is in the footwell. But that did enable Lee to give us a CD fit, which was incredibly similar to Roy Whiting. And we got that the next day, the Sunday, the day Martyn joined the inquiry as a journalist. So the first few hours were really, really full on. And I have nothing but respect for the uniform officers who did a fantastic job. Going back to Martyn's point about what's your memory, my memory is far more scarred than Martyn's. Two things happened to me in this inquiry. One was unknown to me until the time. My mum lived opposite Roy Whiting. So I couldn't see my mum for several weeks because the suspect lived opposite. And when he went to prison, I was very glad that I went down and did it with my mum. And the second thing that happened was 10 days into the inquiry, my dad died. And I couldn't go and see my mum because Whiting was still out at that time. So I've got slightly different memories to Martyn. It was a bad time for me personally. But I do remember two other things that will never leave me. And one was Paul Whitehouse, the chief constable at the time, walked into me and he called me Tosh. And he said, Tosh, and he threw his checkbook on the table. And I looked at him and said, I don't owe you any money, do I? And he said, no, but I owe you money. He said, you have an open checkbook. I don't care what this costs, solve it. Which was incredible. I've never, ever, and never will be ever told that again. And the other thing which happened, I don't know if I've told Martyn this, was 3 Wednesdays in a row, at about 11 o'clock in the morning, I'll get a phone call from the Prime Minister's private secretary. Have you got an update on the case? Because the Prime Minister's going into PMQs. And if you look on Hansard, it came up several times in PMQs. And I was actually briefing his main aide just before he walked in there, which I found absolutely amazing. I can't think of many police officers who had to do that. And I got the phone calls because the original SIO had left and they had a new SIO. And then that one changed again. We had, in the end, 4 SIOs on this case. So I was the continuity, if you like.
If you like the show and want to listen ad-free, head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. You can now subscribe to our ad-free tier for just £4 a month and get unlimited access to our entire back catalogue, completely uninterrupted.
Or if you love the show and want to support what we do, you can become a True Criminals Insider.
For just £3 a month, becoming an insider means you're directly supporting the podcast you love. Your support helps us create even more captivating stories and dive deeper into the most gripping true crime cases. It keeps the show going and the stories alive.
So whether you want ad-free listening or to help support the show, head over to patreon.com/True Criminals and choose the option that works for you.
Thanks for listening and for all your support. We couldn't do this without you.
Are you drawn to the mystery of unsolved crimes? Are you familiar with Pennsylvania? Welcome to Keystone Cold Cases, a podcast that revisits unsolved cases in Pennsylvania in an effort to bring these forgotten victims back into the light. Our podcast delves into real-life cold cases that have baffled investigators and left families in anguish. Join us as we discuss the facts of the case and provide our thoughts and opinions. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts or visit our Facebook and Instagram pages or our website at kccpod.com.
Tosh, was it Tony Blair at the time? And if so, what did the Prime Minister say in PMQs?
It was Tony Blair. The first question was, it was raised first time in Parliament before she'd been found. And it was because the mum, Sarah's campaign, had attracted so much attention. And from memory, the question was asked by a Sussex MP, actually, to the PM. And then it came up a lot over Sarah's law in Parliament, in PMQs, because we're jumping ahead of the story, but once this tragedy unfolded, Sarah started a massive campaign which was raised in Parliament several times in PMQs. So, yeah, there are memories for me that are life-changing, like how many times you get a phone call from Secretary to the PM, but also sadness because my mum lived opposite and my dad died.
Tosh, can you tell us how you got on to Roy Whiting as a suspect?
Yes, so again, the second hero of this case for me is a guy called Steve Wagstaff, who was a detective sergeant. So on the night, we had a guy called Paul Williams who ran the intelligence wing of Worthing Police Station and covered this area. And Paul, quite rightly, said to his team, he called them in at about 9 o'clock on the Saturday night, and he said, we need to start profiling are high-risk offenders, and we had several. We actually had, on our area, the most high-risk paedophile in Sussex because he targeted boys and girls, which meant he was really high risk. But, of course, on the list, Roy Whiting was number 2 to this other person, and the intelligence team was sent out to see the top 3. They couldn't find number 1. They found Whiting's address opposite my mum, but he wasn't in. And they found number 3 and 4, who were both had strong alibis. And so they decided to revisit Whiting on the Sunday morning because they hadn't located him on Saturday night. They located him. They knew him because he was a high-risk sex offender. They visited him on a regular basis. So they knew him and they walked in and said, look, we want to talk to you about what happened last night. What were you doing last night? And he said, I was out looking for children. And believe it or not, he can say that, can't he?
He said he was out looking for children.
Yeah. What he said was, I went to all the fairgrounds between here and Hove on the 259. And he said, I looked up where all the fairgrounds were and where all the things attracting children were. And I drove to all those to look at children because I love children. And was adamant he stayed on the A259 corridor, which in fact he did because the 7 phone calls we got ranged all the way from Brighton to Arundel. So he clearly was driving up and down the A259. But he was adamant he didn't leave the A259. And the officers weren't happy because they saw a white van outside the house. And even by now, we knew a white van was going to feature majorly in this inquiry. And it was only day 2 when we ascertained, depressingly, that there were 4 million white vans in the UK on the day Sarah went missing. So that's a needle in a big haystack. So anyway, the officers realised he had a white van because it was outside the address. They said, is this your white van? And he said, yes. They said, well, we saw you 10 days ago. You didn't have a white van. He said, I bought it 2 days ago from a guy in Southampton. So there were immediately alarm bells ringing. He's admitted he's going out to look at children. There is no law against that at that time, can I just point out. He also has a white van, which we think is a major line of inquiry. So they leave him and sit opposite in their car to debrief what has just happened. And they both decided, and this is why they're my heroes, they decided, we're not happy with this at all. They phoned their boss, Paul Williams, and they said, we're outside Whiting's house, we're happy with the answers. We're not happy he's got a white van, so we're just going to sit here and see how this unfolds. And about half an hour later, Roy Whiting walked out the house, up to the white van, and started searching where the driver's seat was and in the glove box. So the officers thought, no, we're not happy with this. So they walk over and say, what are you doing? And he said, I'm looking for something. And why are you still here? I thought you'd gone. And they said, well, we didn't go, and we're really interested why you're now searching your van. And as they're doing that, unbelievably, because I did actually think this was a wind-up, because it doesn't happen in real life. As they're doing that, a bit of paper flutters down from the dashboard and lands on the feet in front of Whiting between him and Steve Wagstaff. And I actually said to Steve Wagstaff, this is a wind-up, isn't it? It didn't really just fall out on your feet. And he said, no, it did, really. So they pick up the bit of paper, and it's a diesel receipt for 9:30 odd that evening, showing that Whiting had filled up at Buck Barn service station, which is about 16 miles north of the coast, on the way to Horsham on the A24, and filled up with diesel. That meant he had directly lied to the officers, who specifically said, did you go anywhere north of the A259? And based on that and the fact that he had a white van no one knew about, they arrested him for abduction. Very, very brave decision. A lot of officers wouldn't have done that. And that actually solved our case, as you'll hear later.
Tosh, forgive my ignorance, but at that stage, would the officers have been allowed to search his van, or would you have needed a warrant for that?
If he'd been arrested, he hadn't been when they walked up, they would have had the power under Section 18 case to search that van. But it was a brave decision because there are 4 million white vans, and a receipt showing he'd gone 14 miles out of his way to fill up with petrol. It's dodgy, but a lot of people wouldn't have made that arrest. And by making that arrest, of course, the van became ours, and we low-loaded it into a forensic bay. And, of course, as you'll hear later, the van was 2/3 of the forensic evidence.
So within 24 hours, Tosh, you had a suspect under arrest. You had Sarah's older brother, Lee, as a prime witness. You put the two of them together in an identity parade, but Lee, Sarah's brother, didn't pick out Roy Whiting, did he?
I wasn't there for that, to be fair, but you are right. He didn't pick him out.
That must have been a disappointment for you.
Obviously, and also Roy Whiting, unlike his previous offence, which we'll talk about later, where he basically sang like a canary, Roy Whiting went no comment throughout the interviews. So we had a witness not picking out an ID parade. We had a no comment stance from the suspect. And as we'll get to later, that was a massively difficult time when myself and Alan Ladley had to end up talking at length to Chief Constable about, we're going to have to let this guy go. And we think he's murdered a child and he's already abducted and raped a child before. How on earth do we manage that? And that was a very difficult time for me, trying to manage that risk.
How did you manage that risk?
Well, that does lead to a bit of a funny story. So we asked the Chief Constable for surveillance teams to let Whiting out. And we needed 4 surveillance teams because one would be resting and the other 3 would be working. We ended up with 3 surveillance teams for 2 12-hour shifts, and one was resting. And within 2 days of us putting him onto surveillance, because he'd been released because we couldn't charge him, we had real problems. And I remember getting a phone call from a detective sergeant who said, Gov, I've got a real problem. And I said, what's the problem? He said, we keep losing Whiting. And I said, you keep what? You keep losing Whiting? You can't lose Whiting. That means a murder of another child. I said, you're a surveillance team. How are you losing him? He said, well, you're surveillance trained, you know. He said, we can do trains, we can do foot, we can do car, we can't do bike. I said, what do you mean bike? He said, he's on a push bike. And if anyone who knows Crawley, there are hundreds of Twittons, pathways. It's a huge council estate, Crawley. Masses and masses of big council estates. One of the new towns built in the 50s. And these Twittons meant that Whiting, he didn't even know it's being followed, but he's using the Twittons because he grew up in Crawley, and the surveillance team can't keep up with them and don't have bikes. So I said, not being rude, you're a detective sergeant, use your initiative, and don't lose him again. So about an hour later, he phoned back and he said, well, there's good news and bad news. And I said, what's that? He said, well, the good news, Roy Whiting hasn't got a bike anymore. And I said, why is that then? He said, we stole it. It's in the lost property section of Crawley Police Station. We took away his tool because we couldn't keep up with him. I said, OK, well, that's using your initiative. I can't argue with that. And if it's logged in the found property, we could probably get away with this. What's the bad news then? He said, well, it gets worse. He said, because we took his bike away, he stole a car. And I went, you're joking. And he said, no, he stole a car and we watched him steal the car. We called the uniform to arrest him for stealing a car. And he drove off and had a high-speed car chase. But he's now in custody. So that was an incredible turn of events. To stop a man using a bike because we couldn't follow him and keep the public safe, we conveniently remove his bike and put it in the police found property, for him unexpectedly go and steal a car and then be chased by the police. And he was going the wrong way down the dual carriageway on the way to Gatwick Airport before the police rammed the car and made it safe. So an incredible story, but the end result was our main suspect, who was a huge risk to the public because of his previous conviction and what we think he'd done now, was now in custody. And unbelievably, the story continues. He admits the theft of the car. He goes to court the next day, pleads guilty, and unbelievably, I think he got 22 months in prison. The judge hammered him, absolutely hammered him, for what was a theft of a car. But the judge made a big speech about you put the public at risk, you went the wrong way down a dual carriageway, you put police officers at risk. And he sentenced him to 22 months. I might be wrong, it might be 24 months, but it was a big sentence, which, of course, I just went, oh, thank God, because the risk is gone. I mean, Alan Ladley and I lost sleep every night about what happens if he does it again. And even putting 3 surveillance teams out at a cost of £12,000 a day to keep the public safe didn't work because he was using a bike. So it was an extraordinary chapter, and we got him locked up, and that's the point.
Gosh, there's all this stuff going on that the public would have no idea about. And at the same time, you're still trying to find a missing little girl. And meanwhile, Sarah's family, particularly her mum, Sarah, were working hard and closely with the press to try and keep this in the public eye. It's extraordinary to hear the backstory, which obviously you probably know most of, Martyn, but it's extraordinary that all this time you've got to do all that behind the scenes as well as try and find Sarah.
Well, and actually that brings out a positive that I think Martyn will comment on. This was, to my knowledge, the first case ever where the inquiry was swamped. And that led to an unusual piece of behaviour that I'll talk about in a moment that Martyn will probably comment on. So when I say swamped, let's just go through the numbers. By day 3, Whiting's still in custody. We haven't had the car chase saga yet. He's about to be released. We had 1,000 police officers now involved in this case. That is 1 in 3 police officers in Sussex. So 1 in 3, amazing. And we were swamped in every angle. We were swamped by the media. We were swamped by 2,000 or 3,000 calls coming into the incident room every day. And then we had all this with Whiting trying to prepare for him being released without putting the public at risk. And everybody was swamped, which led to Alan Ladley and I speaking to the Chief Constable and saying, we need a senior police officer to run the media because we can't cope with that. And Martyn will correct me, I'm sure, if I'm wrong, but Nigel Yeo's rolled out, Assistant Chief Constable, in uniform, and he becomes the media lead for this case. And that was incredibly good practice that has now been adopted by every force, every major inquiry since. And you saw it in Nicola Bulley recently. It becomes a Cat A case. You have a senior uniform officer running the media strategy to allow the detectives to worry about things like how much does the surveillance team cost? How do you put him under surveillance? How do we get his bike taken, put in a lost property office or whatever? And so I'm sure Martyn would come in on that because I know the media really appreciated Nigel Yeo's role and allowed us to focus on all the other stuff that was bubbling along with 1,000 officers. And don't forget the 2,000 members of the public who turned up every day saying, can we help?
No, you make a very good point, Tosh. I do vividly remember Nigel being parachuted in to let you and Alan Ladley get on with being detectives. And I think you're right. I think it was a model that was followed in other high-profile inquiries, particularly those that became high media stories. And I think one of the lessons also that was learned then for police forces was that you had to be very careful the figure you chose. It needed to be an older officer and a kind of avuncular figure who was good at dealing with the media, but was also good on TV in the sense that she was a friendly face who could encourage anybody with information to come forward. What you didn't want was an aggressive officer who would not encourage people to come forward with information. And I think Nigel was a shining example of that. But you talk about being swamped, and I was intrigued, and this is something I probably haven't told you before. I remember doing one of those early press conferences when you were appealing for any sightings of Sarah's dress. She was wearing a blue dress, and you wanted to know anybody who might have found it, seen it. And I remember leaving that press conference. I did my nightly report about the search, the appeal for this blue dress. And as I and my cameraman were driving away from Littlehampton on the dual carriageway, we spotted in the hedge separating the 2 lanes quite a big piece of blue material. So we stopped, we phoned either the press office or the incident room, I can't remember, and reported this. And I thought, we'll just sit there, keep the camera handy. Within a few minutes, a police car will zoom up with the sirens and the blue lights going and retrieve what could be a potential bit of evidence. Now, we waited, I reckon, 2-3 hours and nothing happened. And we went home. Now, that's not a criticism. You'd probably had 100 calls about bits of blue material on that same day.
Yeah.
And it really made me understand how you needed to prioritise the information you were getting, because, as you say, it was a flood, thousands and thousands of calls.
It was. And the thing I'm proud about for this case, because to be honest, as your listeners will find out, it wasn't that hard to solve. That's just the fact of it. It isn't a fantastic detective job to solve this case, as you'll hear in part 2, because the forensic evidence was overwhelming. But the reason I'm proud of this inquiry, from my role and Alan Ladley's role, because I've already told you about other heroes who helped solve this case far more than I could ever do, was the best practice that came out. We were thinking on our feet, and going back to Martyn's point, we were getting over 1,000, sometimes 2,000 calls a day. And we came up with this idea, Alan and I, of you've just got to get a process where we get 25 nuggets a day. That's all we want. And one of those nuggets would have been Martyn's blue dress. So we brought in, we named them the flower sifters, and we brought in a detective sergeant with 6 TCs, and they were really all very grumpy because they wanted to be out there finding Sarah, not listening to phone calls. But we brought in the flower sifters, and we said, you're going to listen to over 1,000 calls. We don't want more than 25 hitting our inbox. That's what stopped the flooding. That's what stopped the swamping. And suddenly we were getting really focused inquiries because experienced detectives were filtering the public calls.
And interestingly, one of those calls that did prove interesting was from a psychic, wasn't it?
Indeed, yes, the psychic. So more than one. We had numerous psychics come into this case, and I remember one in particular for 2 reasons. One was that she came from Lancashire, and I was told, being the deputy SIO, you're always trying to protect the SIO from stuff distracting that person from their job, because their job is the most important on the inquiry. And so a front office guy came up and said, I need to see Helen Ladley. And I said, I'm his brake, if you like. I'm the windbreak. What is the problem? I'll decide if you need to see Helen Ladley. And he said, well, there's a lady downstairs who knows where Sarah is, and she's got a map. And I thought, OK, this is going to be another psychic, because we'd had a few psychics. One of the decisions you have to make when you're on inquiry is, are you going to follow lines of inquiry, including psychics? And interestingly, because I know your last podcast was with Hamish, and Hamish Campbell, I stand to be corrected, but he took the view that psychics would be included. And it's a decision SIOs have to make. We made the decision that we wouldn't include psychics, and we had over 300. But anyway, I digress. Because this woman's driven from Lancashire, she won't go home without speaking to Helen Ladley. I go down to speak to this lady, and she is an absolutely sterling member of the public who, as a sideline, is a psychic. And she's driven all this way to speak personally to us. And she handed me a map, and she said, I spoke to Sarah last night. She's in the afterlife now, but she's okay. And she's told me where she is, and I've drawn a map. And this map had, I've still got it actually, I've got it at home. The map had a railway line on it, and then a field, and then a main road. And it had a cross in the ground, about 40 yards from the main road, next to an entrance through a gate. And she says, that's where she is, but I'm sorry, she's gone. And I went, okay, thank you, I'll take your details. And I took her details, took the map, put it in my book, and quite frankly, forgot about it. And then we found her in a field with a railway line at the back, 40 yards from a main road. And I suddenly thought, oh my God.
It was on July the 17th, wasn't it? The news that everybody had been dreading. Just talk us through, Tosh, how Sarah was found.
So for anyone who owns a horse, they'll know this answer. There's one plant that's fatal to horses, and that is ragwort. And a field in North Sussex, near the A29, sort of northwest Sussex, a farmer said to his farmhand, can you go in the field and clear the ragwort, because I'm going to put the ponies in tomorrow. So he goes in, starts clearing the ragwort, and sadly finds a partial grave with a child in it, and dials 999. And interestingly, we're on day 17. One of the biggest problems for us, Martyn's touched on it, is Helen Ladley and I both had a view, and then after Helen Ladley, Peter Kennick, was we have to keep this in the news every day. So we had numerous strategies to get the family to do something every day to keep us in the news. And Martyn alluded to that in his chat earlier. And one of them I remember was, we said, have you had any letters? And they said, yeah, we had loads of letters. Have you written any letters? And they said, no. We said, well, why don't you go and write a letter on a beach? And we'll photograph you, the kids writing to Sarah. And that made massive news and kept it in the news. The point of the story is, by day 17, we were running out of ideas. Nobody had any ideas left how to keep 22 satellite vans at Littlehampton Police Station. We were going to lose the press. And ironically, that was the day that this phone call came in. I think everybody was expecting a call. Everyone by then knew that she wasn't coming home. And a huge convoy of people went to the Payne house, because the detective sergeant who had been tasked to give the death message to the parents, he had 3 envelopes in his pocket, interestingly. Well, the first envelope was, if we find her alive. The second envelope was, if we don't find her at all. And the third envelope was, if we find her dead. And a psychologist had written the message so that he would deliver to the family. But of course, as soon as 2 things happened. As soon as the officers rushed out to go and look at the body, because the phone call had come in, the media followed. So it was very quickly obvious that the police had found a body. And then literally 2 hours later, Sean Scott, the detective sergeant, is sent out with his third envelope. We found the body. We think it's Sarah. And he was followed by the media. And it's the only time I ever get annoyed with Sky News, because Sean was literally walking down the drive to tell the family in person, with dignity, with a strategy written by a psychologist, we found her, and Sky News broke the story.
I apologise for that. I don't remember that detail, but if you say that's what happened, then absolutely I take your word for it, Tosh. Can I also ask you how you felt? I remember being there at Littlehampton Police Station on that day when you and Alan suddenly came out. I seem to remember the two of you walking past me, looking very glum. And I'm sure I said something like, "Have you found her?" And I think you both just blanked me. And I completely understand why. But it seemed as though the bad news that everybody had come to expect by that stage was unravelling. How did you feel at that moment?
Most people I spoke to felt the same as me, which was, I'm interested in your view, Martyn, but I felt one relief, because the torture on the Payne family was tangible. It was horrendous, and they were all exhausted. And I felt relief that we had an answer to the question, where is Sarah? I also felt almost the deja vu. I had accepted days before that Sarah wasn't coming out, as indeed you told us to say, so did you. And then anger. She was such a beautiful little girl. Everybody loved her. The school loved her. Neighbours loved her. Her family loved her. Everyone loved Sarah Payne. Her photo was beautiful. And then you find out basically some bastards murdered her. And I got very angry very quickly.
Do you remember your feelings, Martyn, as a journalist when you heard the news?
Well, I think as Tosh has said, and I've probably made that clear, that as time went on, I too felt that this was a story that was not going to end happily. And I think perhaps more than other cases, because some of us amongst the journalists had built up such a warm relationship with Sarah's parents and with Tosh and Alan Ladley, the senior investigating officers, I think we did feel it personally. And I think Tosh makes a very interesting point as well. There was a sense of relief that there was a conclusion to the story, however tragic and sad it was, because for many years I've covered the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, and I often think how awful it must be not to know what happened in the case of Madeleine's parents. And this might not be true, but I do remember a sense of feeling that Sarah's parents probably felt that they weren't going to see Sarah again by that stage. And I think knowing her fate was better, in a sense, than not knowing and going on for years and years and years and not having an answer to what happened to her. It's very difficult to judge until you are in that awful position. But I think I shared Tosh's feeling that knowing was better than not knowing.
I agree with that.
This was such an unusual case because Whiting was identified as a suspect and arrested quickly the day after Sarah went missing on July the 2nd. But it took 7 further months of meticulous work by the police to gather sufficient evidence to charge her. And that's what we're going to discuss in part 2 of our Sarah Payne story. So thanks for now to Tosh for being there and sharing those very personal memories. Really sorry that you lost your dad at that time and that you really felt, obviously, that very personal connection with your mum living opposite the man who was eventually convicted of murdering Sarah. We look forward to you joining us in our next episode when we'll be looking at the extraordinary forensic work, Roy Whiting's trial and conviction, and the aftermath of this tragic case. Hey listeners, The True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, Executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.